Us. This is a class, the eve before Shavuos, so I thought it would be a great time for us to talk about the Torah, the oral Torah, the written Torah, and how it was passed down through the generations. Any questions relating to the subject matter are very welcome. It's a full schedule, so I'm going to kind of want to move through it. And so if it's a question not related to the direct subject matter, we can discuss it at the end. But any question relating to understanding the subject matter, please feel free when I stop to take a breath to ask questions. All right. We're going to start. I'm going to share the screen now. The origin of Torah, the written Torah, the oral Torah, how they work together, where they come from. How come there's so many arguments in Torah? In the oral Torah, if it's from Hashem. And we'll be discussing many of those subjects. And we're going to go through it at some length. And again, if you have a question or comment I will stop for that. I'm going to ask, first of all, with a question for you. And I'd like you to answer the question, please, whoever can answer the question. What is it that we do on Yom Kippur? If I say Yom Kippur, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Anyone?
Penitence.
Penitence. What do we do on Yom Kippur? Okay. Fasting. Thank you. Penitence and fasting. Yes.
Teshuvah.
Teshuvah. Okay, very good. Where do we know? How do we know you have to fast on Yom Kippur? Who says you have to fast on Yom Kippur? What is that, a rabbinic thing? Is that a custom? Where does it come from that we have to fast on Yom Kippur?
Torah.
It says in the Torah, you have to fast on Yom Kippur, right?
Yes. What about
blowing the shofar? 1 second. What about blowing the shofar? At the end of the day of Yom Kippur, where does that come from? What about reading the Torah on Yom Kippur? Where does that come from? Okay, so those are actually customs. And those things come from the oral Torah. But fasting on Yom Kippur, you say, is written in the Torah that you have to fast, right? The written Torah says you have to fast. Everyone agree with that, right?
Yes, you have to afflict yourself.
Very good. Let's take a look. This is the verse. It shall be as an eternal statute for you. And on the 7th month, on the 10th of the month, you shall afflict yourselves. Whoops, got ahead of myself there for a second. You shall afflict yourselves, and you shall not do any work, neither the native nor the proselyte who dwells among you. The Hebrew word for afflict yourself is ta'anu et nafshotechem. Ta'anu, afflict yourselves. What does afflict yourself mean? The Hebrew word ta'anu means fast, right? Does it? Let's see where else in the Torah we have, in the written Torah, we have the word ta'anu or something like it, using the same root of the word, which means afflict, ta'anu. Let's see what it means in other places in the Torah. God said to Abraham, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. This is the promise. It's called the oath, the covenant between the parts. When Abraham was told by Hashem that his descendants would go to Egypt, and then eventually they would get the land of Israel. And they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. Ve'inu otam, same root, oppress. Now, Lavan, when Lavan is chasing Yaakov and wants to kill him, and Hashem says to him, don't touch him, so they make a covenant, they make a pact, and Lavan says to Yaakov, they made a little mound, this is in the Torah, and Lavan says to him, if you afflict my daughters, ta'aneh, same word, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me, okay? Shechem, you know the story of Shechem, right? He captured Dinah, and Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Chivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her, and he lay with her, and he violated her, raped her. Vaye'aneha. You shall not oppress any widow or orphan. Te'anun. So let's talk about it. It says on Yom Kippur, you're supposed to te'anu et nafshotechem. Are you supposed to oppress people? Are you supposed to afflict people? Are you supposed to rape people? Are you supposed to oppress people? What does it mean, ta'anu? Where do we get the idea that ta'anu means fasting? Again, the shorish, the root of the word ta'anu is ayin nun hey, ta'aneh. And we have oppress, we have afflict, we have violate. Nowhere anywhere else in the Torah does the word ta'anu mean you shall fast. But yet, we take it for granted that when the Torah says you shall afflict yourself, it means you shall fast. Where does that come from? That comes from the Oral Torah. The Oral Torah tells us that in the case of Yom Kippur, when it says afflict, specifically it means fast. Don't eat and don't drink. Can I ask everyone to mute yourselves, please? So where do we get fast from? Some more examples. The Pesach Seder. So matzah is written in the written Torah that we have to eat matzah. From where do we get having an egg on the Seder table and all the other customs of the Seder? Most of the customs of the Seder are not written in the Torah. Drinking 4 cups of wine is not written in the written Torah. Hanukkah candles, definitely not written in the written Torah. Hanukkah came much later after the Torah was closed. Fasting on Yom Kippur is an example we just gave. Bar and Bat Mitzvah. Where do we know that a boy at 13 becomes Bar Mitzvah or a girl at 12 becomes Bat Mitzvah? Where does that come from? It's all in the Oral Torah. So we're going to talk about Oral Torah, and there are 4 aspects to the Oral Torah. There's the received Oral Torah, which means God-given explanations for each of the commandments. So there are words in the Torah tells us a commandment, like fast on Yom Kippur. The Torah doesn't say fast, it says afflict. We need to know what that means. So there's received, we received from Moses, from Moshe, that what it means is fast. So these are received, in other words, the explanations of the written word of the Torah, this is received. That's one. Then we have derived, laws of Torah that we derived from the written Torah and the received oral Torah. So they're not clear in the Torah. It doesn't say what to do in that case, but we derive it. Then there is legislated, new laws legislated by rabbinic sages like Hanukkah and Purim. And then there's customary customs initiated by the people to enhance an aspect of Judaism like apples and honey. What we're going to discuss tonight is 2 of them. And we're going to start with the received Torah, the received oral Torah, the God-given explanations for each of the commandments. We're going to go through examples of this, and we're going to see what this means. So before I go any further, any questions? Comments? Questions? Okay. Just get this link. And sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay. The questions people ask, why do we need the oral Torah, the written Torah, the oral Torah? Why do we need an oral Torah altogether? Why does the written Torah require explanation to go along with it? Why isn't it just the written Torah and that's enough? Why need an oral Torah in the first place? Shouldn't we assume that wherever God wanted to tell us was included in the Bible? So there's a story in the Talmud about a non-Jew who came to Shammai, the great sage Shammai, and he asked him, how many Torahs do you have? Shammai replied, 2, the written Torah and the oral Torah. Said the man, regarding the written Torah, I trust you. But regarding the oral, I do not trust you. Convert me on condition that you will teach me just the written Torah. What do you think Shammai did? Shammai kicked him out.
No way.
Yep, kicked him out. Said, get out of here. You're not serious. And he wouldn't deal with him.
Send him to Hillel.
He went to Hillel eventually. But you know what? That he was ready for Hillel's approach after he went through Shammai's approach first. Then he came to Hillel, and he was ready to accept what Hillel taught him. But Shammai didn't. Shammai kicked him out. Shammai was very strict, and Shammai felt that by kicking him out, he would have him maybe realize that he'd made a mistake, and then he would maybe come back. And he did go, because he was humbled by Shammai. We'll soon see what happened when he went to Hillel. Okay, going back to the share. Rambam writes, every mitzvah that God gave to Moses was given with its explanation. God would tell Moses the verse, and then tell him its meaning, explanation, and all that was contained in the ingenious wording of the verse. So the way the Rambam says it, it was nothing new that Moshe came and thought up. When God wrote the Torah, he told him every word what to write, and he would tell Moses, this is the verse and this is its meaning. So the entire Oral Torah is a God-given, in the Oral Torah, there are God-given explanations of what the words mean. One example of that, by the way, which we don't bring up here, is an eye for an eye. And an eye for an eye never meant an eye for an eye. An eye for an eye actually meant we pay money for the damage, and this is something which the Talmud goes through at length. Okay, let's see what happened. Let's talk about some of the things that we need to have explanations from the Oral Torah. One of the biggest problems in the Bible, written Bible, is the letters. There are gaps in the letters. And this, we're going to see how the letters themselves, I'll soon show it, how the letters themselves require us to have the Oral Torah to explain it. So what happened? He came to Hillel. The same man came to Hillel. Hillel saw that he was sincere, but misguided. So on the first day, Hillel taught him the Aleph Beit. Aleph, Beit, Veit, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin. Everyone knows these letters. And the next day, Hillel said to him, this means tough, this means sin, this means shin, this means resh, etc. Now the man was smart, and he said to him, yesterday you didn't tell it to me that way. So Hillel said to him, if you rely on me to teach you what the written letters are, then you should also rely on me to teach you what the Oral Torah is. In other words, how do you know an Aleph is an Aleph? Because I've taught you that. So accept also the Oral Torah, also the teachings. Let's talk about, so that's the letters themselves require Oral Torah to tell you what the letters are. That's number one. Now we have vowels. Let's talk about vowels. So the word bird, what is the word? Please unmute yourself if you can tell me. B-R-D. What does that word spell if you add vowels?
Bread.
Bread, okay. Anything else?
Board.
Uh-huh.
Bird. Buried.
Very good. So let's have a few examples. A few examples are board, read,
Yeah. Bread.
abroad, bread. There's several examples that we can use. Bared, right? It can mean many things. Now, we're going to take this example that a word, if I just give you letters without vowels, consonants without vowels, you could read it in many different ways. I'm going to give you an example in Torah. Remember, in Torah, you only have consonants. You don't have vowels. The vowels are added. And in the Torah itself, the written Torah, we don't have any vowels. So I'm going to show you an example of a word that without knowing the Oral Torah, what the Oral Torah teaches about the vowels, you don't know what it means. Let's take a look. This is what the Torah scroll looks like without the vowels, just the consonants. And then we add the vowels. So you can see that reading the words, the consonants themselves, you don't know how to read it. So let's check this example. Lo tevashel gedi in something imo of its mother. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's what? What?
Milk. Halav.
Chalav is milk, right? I think everybody would know. Anybody who asked them, what are you not allowed to cook a kid in? it would say in its mother's milk. However, that is a bit of a stretch. Because that word could be written bachale, bachalav, or it could also be written bechelev. The word chalav means milk. The word chelev means fat. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's fat. Maybe that's what it means. Maybe we were mistaken all along. Maybe it really is fat, not milk. No problem with milk. You know the story they tell about the monk, who an 80-year-old monk who goes down decides to do some research, and he goes down into the basement of the Vatican, and he's studying for a couple of years, and he comes up, and he's crying bitterly, and he says, "We got it all wrong. It says celebrate." Anyway, so I think you got it. Maybe it says in his mother's fat, but we don't read it that way. We read bachalevimo, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. How do we know that that's what it means? That is, the Oral Torah tells us that. So the vowel, we need the letters themselves, we need the Oral Torah to tell us what the letters are, what they're called, what they are. The vowels, certainly we need the Oral Torah to tell us what that is. And then there's punctuation. Okay, before I go to punctuation, anyone want to stop? Say anything?
Yeah, so, Oral Torah is interpretation of written Torah.
It's the Oral Torah is the explanation and interpretation of written Torah, but as we'll learn, plus more.
But there's interpretation, then it might allow more and more different interpretations of the written Torah.
There could be many, you would think there'd be many different interpretations, correct. We'll get there. We'll get there. We'll get there. We're going to discuss it all. Anyone else? Okay. Going back to our PowerPoint. Yes?
I've heard that Oral Torah is just another word for the Talmud.
The Talmud is a part of the Oral Torah. Most of the Oral Torah is written in the Talmud, but it's only part of it. The Talmud doesn't finish there. It kind of starts there, but it goes way beyond, because the Talmud has a lot of explanation, and the Decoded Jewish law, and Rambam, and thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of books that have been written to explain the Talmud. So it's a lot more than that. There's also the Kabbalah and the Medrash, many other things that are considered part of the Oral Torah. What we are doing now is studying Oral Torah. What I'm teaching you now is Oral Torah. This very discussion here. Yes.
Also, the fact that you have updates all the time, because you need new laws, they are becoming also part of the Oral Torah.
Yes, but they're only part of the Oral Torah if they are part of Torah. And we're going to get to that. We're going to discuss that. Okay. Punctuation. Let's talk about punctuation. In the Torah, as we saw before, there is no punctuation. Okay, let me ask you, how many people here, I didn't see exactly how many men and women, what do you think about this statement? Anybody agree with the statement? I'm glad that we're remote and not in the same room right now, because usually tomatoes would be flying. Okay, let's take a look at this. Not so bad now, right? So here's an example of the same statement. Without punctuation, you could read it either way you want. Okay? Punctuation is extremely important. They say that wars, what was it? There was some war that was lost because of a comma missing or something. How about that one? So punctuation is very, very important.
Let's eat grandma.
Okay. Alva menorah arba'a gvi'im meshukadim kaftareha ufracheha. It says in the menorah there were 4 cups. The menorah was the candelabra that was in the picture. You see the picture there? the golden candelabra that was in the temple, and it had six branches and a stem, which is 7 lights. And on the menorah there were 4 geviim, means cups, meshukadim, decorated, kaftareha ofracheha, it had knobs and flowers. The question is, what was decorated? So you could either put the comma there. On the menorah there were 4 cups, comma, and next after that it says decorated its knobs and its flowers, or goblets they call it, or it could say on the menorah there were 4 goblets decorated, comma, its knobs and its flowers. On the menorah they had knobs and flowers, and it had 4 cups decorated. Which one is it? It could be either one. Just reading the written Torah, we don't really know which one it is. And as a matter of fact, there's a debate among the sages about which one. Now, there's also the message. So we have now the letters themselves, we have the vowels that requires Oral Torah, and we have the punctuation that requires Oral Torah. Okay? Now, let's talk about the message itself. Okay? This is the Shema. This is the Shema as it's written on a mezuzah without any punctuation, the first 2 parts of the Shema. Let's see what it says in the Shema and try and understand what it means. These words that I command you to this day shall be upon your heart. What exactly does that mean? How do you put those things on your heart? Open heart surgery? I had a friend who had open heart surgery and they replaced this valve with a pig valve. And you know, there's nothing wrong with having a pig valve inserted in a person's heart. You're allowed to use pork for things other than eating. You're not allowed to use it for eating, but for other things it's okay. Anyway, so he's not a religious man, he's a close friend. So I called him and asked him, how you doing? He says, I'm doing great, but I hate to tell you what they put in my heart. And I told him, oh, there's no problem with that, except now you can't call yourself a Jew at heart. Anyway, so what does it mean you shall put these words on your heart? You shall bind them for a sign upon your hand. What? How do you bind the words upon your hand? Have you ever seen anyone taking a mezuzah or the Shema or a Torah and tying it on their hand? This is referring to tefillin, obviously, but it doesn't say in the Torah how to do it. They shall be for totafot, between your eyes. What does that mean? Between your eyes? What shall be? How do you put them between your eyes? You shall inscribe them upon the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. Anyone seen the whole Torah written on somebody's doorpost or upon their gate? That would take quite a lot of doing. And imagine having a scribe, when you build a house or buy a house, you got to hire a scribe to write the whole Torah on your day. Obviously it means a mezuzah, but how do we know that? We wouldn't know that without the Oral Torah. Another more evidence of the fact that the written Torah itself is pointing to the Oral Torah. The Oral Torah is not something separate that came later, but it's part and parcel with the written Torah. It says in the Torah, if you want to eat meat, you need only slaughter your cattle and small animals that God will have given you in the manner that I have prescribed. You will not find anywhere in the Torah that you prescribed how to slaughter an animal. Just doesn't say it in the Torah. And all these things, what do they mean? How do we know what they mean? The Torah itself says, the mitzvah that I am prescribing to you today is not too mysterious or remote from you. It's not in heaven so that you should say, who shall go up to heaven and bring it to us so that we can hear and keep it? It's not over the sea so that you should say, who will cross the sea and get it for us so we'll be able to hear it and keep it? It's something that is very close to you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart so that you can keep it. I'm placing it before you. You can choose good, choose life. So first of all, how is it close to us if the words don't seem to make sense? If so obscure? Second of all, what does it mean when we say choose? How can you choose if you don't know what it is? So therefore, what the Torah is telling us is that there is an oral Torah that goes along with the written Torah, and it is close to us. It is not in the heavens because it's been given to us and explained to us. I'm going to stop for a moment here and ask if I see there's a couple of chats that I'm going to see if there's any questions here or something. Give me a second. Okay, so there's a question here that someone is saying, as someone who has done technical writing, I often wonder how so many descriptions are obscure as to not be clearly understood. Even taking into account vowels and punctuation, it could be so much more clearly written. So I want to go through this and actually answer this question, and this is what we're going to do. Any other questions or comments?
Maybe this is done on purpose to allow the flexibility of the interpretation.
So let's say you have flexibility of interpretation. One person says you're not allowed to cook a kid in its mother's fat. One person says you're not allowed to cook a kid in its mother's milk. Half the people won't eat in their house. The other half of the people won't eat in their house. They both think they're keeping kosher. They're both very religious, trying to serve God, and neither of them knows what they're supposed to do. So there's got to be a way to figure out what this means, because the Torah is our guideline, is our life lesson on how to live. How could the Torah give us stuff that doesn't tell us how to live, which doesn't tell us how to live? The whole thing is very hard to understand.
So essentially, the oral Torah was given at the same time as the written Torah?
As a matter of fact, what I'm going to say to you is as follows, and we'll elaborate on it a little bit later, that the written Torah is the code. The Torah is an oral Torah, but God gave us a written Torah by which is the code to keep us on track to remember what the oral Torah is actually, that it's true. We'll soon see. It's actually a code. In other words, if it had all been oral, you'd be able to make up whatever you want. Therefore, we have the written Torah, which everything has to be consistent with the written Torah, and therefore we have both. We have the oral Torah and the written Torah. We're going to talk now about why that is, and why it was given to us that way, and why it wasn't more. Go back to here. Okay. Why is it necessary to have an oral Torah? As a matter of fact, originally the Talmud tells us that we learn from what's written in the Torah that we're not allowed to write the oral Torah. We're not allowed to read the oral Torah from a text. That changed when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, saw that Jewish people were no longer, they were being spread out because of the exile, and there was no longer hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students studying together the Torah and spending their lives studying it and teaching it and learning it, everything 100 times. They would learn everything by heart 100 times, and they were very faithful to the Torah, and they were very, very committed to Hashem and to recognizing that the Torah is from God. And all that started to change. So he saw the need to write down and actually create the Mishnah, which took together. There were many writings before that. The writings were written, but they weren't published. And he took the writings and he published them. Let's go on and talk about the benefits of the oral Torah. Why is it necessary to have an oral Torah? And we're going to go through a few examples here in English and talk about we're going to talk about actually the difficulties with an oral Torah. What could be the benefits of an oral Torah when it's so easy to misunderstand it? And as you said before, someone said before, maybe to be flexible and understand it flexibly. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is the Second Amendment of the United States. How can you interpret it? And you know what? There are people who believe very strongly in arms control, gun control, and there are people who believe very strongly that every weapon should be absolutely allowed. And both of them base it on the Constitution, Second Amendment of the Constitution. The collective rights theory says that this amendment was intended to make sure there should be a well-regulated militia, means that the states can maintain an armed militia, was not intended to give it to the individual. So because a well-regulated militia is necessary, therefore the people, meaning the militia for the people, are allowed to bear arms. Then there's the other theory, which is the individual right theory, that citizens can possess firearms because the right of the people to keep and bear arms, they focus on the people. So there are two ways to read the same thing. Doesn't seem very good for an oral tradition, right? I mean, it's written and you could interpret it either way. Take one of the reasons that we really need to have an oral tradition is because language changes. Language changes through the ages. Can you quickly look through this and tell me if you understand quickly how to make this recipe? I don't think I'm going to do this on a Tuesday night show because it's a little complicated. Take a good quality of onion. Go ahead and read it to yourself. So if you study it carefully, you can kind of figure out what it says. But that language, nobody would write a recipe like that today. It's just language has changed so much. It's completely different than it used to be. Now, we're going to talk now about the benefits of an oral teaching. So one thing is because there are different ways of interpreting things. Language changes, so the oral teaching avoids ambiguity in a written text. What does this mean exactly? It could be seen this way, could be seen that way. You have the Second Amendment, could be read this way or that way. When you have an oral tradition that tells us, through the generations, we have learned since Moses that this is what it means, gun control, or this is what it means, no gun control. The oral tradition helps us to clearly understand what the written word says, because otherwise it's very ambiguous. You can interpret it any way you want. Another benefit is that Maimonides says, I'm going to read it to you. Moses was commanded at Sinai to teach all of these laws orally and not to record them in writing, so that we would not rely on recorded information that would be readily available, as that would result in a laxity of study. When something is not recorded and its preservation requires of us to learn it by heart, we study it with more concentration and we continuously contemplate the material in order to ensure we remember it and do not forget it. So we want to make sure that we're studying it carefully to understand it and learn it and remember it, because otherwise we will not. And Torah is something which is God's wisdom, as we'll soon see. And we want to fill our minds with it. Torah is not just something you learn once and then put away. It's our way of living. And therefore, we must constantly be learning it and deeply thinking about it. We have a perfect example today. Today, people don't memorize. People do research today. You don't have to memorize anything. You just go to Google and figure it out. We don't need to do the times tables today because we have calculators. Because when you have it, everything in writing, you don't figure out you have to memorize it. So that's another reason why we need to have oral teaching. And another is that when you have oral teaching, it needs to be taught by a living model. You have to go to someone to learn it from them. And the Torah has been taught by great people who are committed, like I said, to Jewish way of life, to Torah observance. That's who we learn Torah from. And it's not enough to Torah to just figure it out on your own. We need a living model from whom to learn, because book learning doesn't really tell us what it's all about. However, how do we know that it was passed down faithfully? You've heard of telephone, right? Broken telephone. How do we know that it was done properly? So the Talmud tells us, what was the order of learning the Oral Torah? Moses learned directly from the Almighty. Moses would teach him. Aaron would then remove himself and sit to Moses' left. Aaron's sons would enter and Moses would teach them. His sons would remove themselves. Elazar would sit to Moses' right, Itamar to Aaron's left. The 70 elders would enter and Moses would teach them. The elders would remove themselves. Then all the people would enter and Moses would teach them. Moses would exit and Aaron would teach it to all those present. Aaron would exit and his sons would teach it to all those present. His sons would exit and the elders would teach it to all those present. Thus everyone learned it 4 times. That was initially. And then Rambam says, afterward, the people would disperse in order to review with one another what they had heard from Moses, and they would write the verse in scrolls. Ministers spread out among all of the people to teach and review until everyone knew the verse and how to read it well. They would also teach the God-given explanation of the verse. The people would write the verse and remember the explanation by heart. Okay, so you heard about the 40 years in the desert they were studying the Torah. A month before Moses died, Moses said to the people, come and I will teach you the Torah. And he gave everyone an opportunity at that point to learn and ask him any questions they had. So they reviewed the whole Torah again. And this is a method of how the Torah was taught initially. And this was all transmitted faithfully from generation to generation. Now, what about the possibility of broken telephone, as we said?
That's right.
1 second. I'm going to share that page again. Anyone know what that says? Now, if I ask you to memorize the shy green lion had too much to drink and fell out the window, and we started passing it on to people, within a short time the lion's going to turn blue, right? And it's going to fall out maybe out of something other than the window, may not fall out, etc. But when you have this mnemonic, these letters written there, this lion can never become blue. Never will this lion become blue. And they will never fall through out of the door because there's a W at the end, which means window. Now, possibly, you could come up with some other words here. But the chances that this interpretation is going to stay becomes much, much greater. And this is what I was saying before, that the oral Torah is the teaching of how to live and what the Torah is telling us. And then you have the written Torah, which keeps us in line. Because look at the words the Torah says. No, it doesn't say that it's okay to, it doesn't say you shouldn't cook a kid in its mother's, you shouldn't kick a kid in its mother's foot. It doesn't, with its mother's foot. It definitely doesn't say that. It says either chalev or chalav, and one or the other. So we know that it's chalav. We've always learned it's chalav, but we have the guidelines in the Torah. I'm going to show a few more of those. We have the guidelines in the Torah that clearly tell us how to figure out what the oral tradition really is. Any other comments or questions?
Yes, this is very interesting indeed. But from your own examples, there are multiple interpretations. Even if you had only vowels, there's multiple interpretation with different meanings from the same basic statement in Torah. So,
yes, but what I'm saying is it's much easier to teach an interpretation of the words, of the letters, than it is to just, it's not like there was a Torah that was just taught and everybody kind of thought, oh, what did it say? It's written down. What we're studying is what it says.
Right, it is. I understand you basically proved necessity of having written Torah. But the question is, since it's written based on kind of original statement without vowels, and there might be different, way to do that, how do you kind of know how to trust to that?
Right. So that's why, that's what I was talking about. the faithfulness of the Torah as it's been passed down from generation to generation. Each generation has to accept what was taught before. The received interpretations were passed down from one generation to the next. There is no debate on the fact that you're not allowed to cook it in its mother's milk, that chalav and not challah. There's no debate about that. Why? Because that was taught by Moses 4 times to the people of that time, continuing to be discussed throughout the entire time in the desert, faithfully taught from generation to generation by people who were into it, who are faithful to it. Writings that were written, not published until the Mishnah, but written down that they had to go back to. The Mishnah took these writings and pulled them together. So it was a faithful transmission from generation to generation. You couldn't make it up. You couldn't just come up with a new example. By the way, I've got to tell you, this is a 6-part course. The part which we're not going to go into today, maybe another time, talks about how we know how it was transmitted properly and it wasn't. I mean, there's a whole one lesson talking about how faithful it was and how we know that it can't be made up along the way. The whole idea of the fact that God came down at Sinai, which we'll celebrate in 2 days from now, on Friday, tomorrow night and Friday, that God came down on Sinai and spoke to us. How do we know it's true? You can see there's historical proof, and one whole lesson. We spent 1.5 hours doing this when we originally did it, so I'm not going to go into it now. But basically, again, you have the written Torah you need, the oral Torah you need to explain it, and the method by which it was taught is foolproof in terms of keeping it honest. Let's go back to the share.
What exactly are the mnemonics that were passed down?
That's the written Torah.
Oh.
The written Torah is the words. Second. When you're sharing screens back and forth, the PowerPoint kind of, there we go. Anyone know what that means? If you read that, you know, I did it when we first did it, every class I started with these things. And after the 3rd class, I just showed it and everybody knew what it meant. Everybody knew what it meant. By the 6th class, everyone remembered what it meant. Because this, once you get it, you're looking at the letters and you're remembering it, you know what it means. And this is something which thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of scholars have been studying. You can't just make it up and change it along the way. Now we're going to go to the second aspect. So we've learned now the first part of the Oral Torah, which is the received Oral Torah. God-given explanations for each of the commandments. So it says, remember the day of Shabbat. It means make Kiddush. It says, don't cook a kid in its mother's something. It means milk, etc., etc. All of the mitzvahs that it says, slaughter the animal as I've commanded you. Those are the laws of Shechita. It says, write them on your doorposts. It means write it on a mezuzah, wrap it up, and put it on the door, and how a mezuzah has to be read. Tie it on your hand. It means put on tefillin. It should be black boxes, etc. It says, put these words on your heart. It means in your heart you should feel love and fear of God. That's what it all means. But then we have another aspect of Torah which is called the derived oral Torah. Those are the laws that we derive from the written Torah and the received oral Torah. And we're going to go into that whole thing. There are laws that are not directly written in the Torah explicitly, and we didn't learn it exactly from Moses what to do in that case. I'm going to show some examples. What are we supposed to do in that case? How do we know that how does the oral Torah know that it's from Hashem, from God, and that it's correct according to Torah? Questions that people ask. Isn't the written Torah together with the received oral Torah enough? Why is the derived oral Torah necessary? Why do we need another derived oral Torah? So here are some examples. And by the way, at this point, I can't see you at all. So if you want to say something, please Feel free to speak up at this point and unmute yourself because I can't see you. And you're welcome to chime in. You shall live in booths for 7 days. What's that called in Hebrew? Everyone knows?
Sukkah.
Sukkah.
What does it mean you shall live in booths for 7 days? How is a sukkah supposed to look? What does it mean live? Come on. Trying to get it to move. There we go. How high should the sukkah be? Can the sukkah be a skyscraper? Torah doesn't say. The written Torah doesn't say. Does a sukkah have to be built specifically for the holiday? What would happen if somebody decided to build a sukkah now? A hut for shade. It's very hot. Build a hut, put covering on top of it, put some vegetation on it. Is it kosher for sukkah, or does it have to be built specifically for the sukkah? Does the sukkah require a mezuzah? It says you should put it on the doors, on your doors and doorposts of your houses and your gates. What about a sukkah? Does it need? Is it like a house? You should live in booths. Does that mean it needs a mezuzah?
How important to answer those questions somewhere is not just people to decide. They know to build sukkah, and that's it.
Well, you're saying that people, it shouldn't be that people should decide on their own. It has to be given the laws, right?
I don't know.
I mean,
The law.
are there such laws? Are there such laws? Do you have to eat? You have to eat in the sukkah. Do you have to eat even a small snack? If you want to eat a piece of gefilte fish, let's say, if you're Ashkenazi, can you eat that outside of the sukkah or not? These are laws that are not written expressly in the Torah. But there has to be, it says in the Torah, Chukah achat lachem, there is one law for all of you, including the convert. It says that clearly in the Torah. You can't have laws. Customs, maybe, different ways of doing things. But the laws of the Torah are specifically for everyone, equally, for all time. So the Torah has to be very specific and tell us all the laws. But it doesn't say it in the written Torah. How do we figure out these laws? And this applies, as we were talking about earlier, Alex, this applies to today's questions. Someone who lives in a mobile home, does he have to place a mezuzah on the doors of the vehicle? How could that be received from Moshe? Imagine that Moshe's great-grandson taught the people, one day there's going to be a mobile home, and in that mobile home we're going to have a question, do you need a mezuzah or not? How could Moshe teach that to the people? Does the mitzvah of saving, this is a relevant one, does the mitzvah of saving a life mean that we must provide a ventilator to everyone? Are we required to manufacture ventilators to give everyone? If someone crosses the date line, does that affect how he or she shall observe Shabbat or any of the Jewish holidays? Is it okay to use a hidden camera in your home to keep an eye on your nanny? So these are questions that obviously could not be received, couldn't be written and couldn't be received. Because if they were written as such, no one would know what they were talking about. Now Hashem, obviously, he wrote the Torah for all generations. Hashem obviously knew what's going to come. But how could he teach it to the people who didn't know? And how would he be able to teach it through the ages? So for that, we have to have a way. And the Torah is for all time. And the Torah is for all situations. And therefore, everything is according to Torah, has an answer in the Torah. How do we figure out, according to the Torah, if you cross the date line, how you keep Shabbat, which nobody knew about then, etc. Therefore, we have to have a way to derive the law of the Torah in that situation. It's a little hard to read this because I had to enlarge it. But this is what Rabbi Yosef Albo, in a book called the Ikrim, he writes, it is impossible that God's Torah could ever be complete in such a way that it will be sufficient for all times. For there are constantly new details, judgments, and events in human affairs, and the laws about these matters would be far too numerous to be enumerated. Never mind impossible to know at that point, too numerous also to enumerate them. So they couldn't all be written. It's not possible. And therefore, we need to have a way to derive these laws.
The details cannot be written.
details of there's the Talmud tells us an interesting question. There is the idea of a firstborn animal. Firstborn animal is kadosh, is holy. Firstborn animal is defined as the first animal birthed by the first child, first offspring birthed by an animal. A female animal has never had a child before. So there's a whole question, what happens if the Talmud says, what happens if you take a womb of one animal, attach it to the womb of another animal, and move the fetus from one animal to the next? And a whole discussion of how we treat the laws of first birthright here, firstborn. Tosfot, one of the great commentaries on the Talmud, says, this is a law that we have no understanding of. Today, they're doing transplants all the time. They're doing artificial insemination. They're doing surrogacy. They're even transplanting uteruses now. So now we look at the Torah, we see the answers there, and then they didn't understand it. But computers, how could you write in the Torah how you deal with a computer on Shabbat? It's not possible to write it. The problem is, we're going to derive the laws. How do we make sure that when we derive the laws, so we can't just make them up as we go along, because if we make them up as we go along, it's not Torah anymore. Torah is God's Torah, God's will. God wants us to behave a certain way, no matter what comes along. L'dorotechem, for all your general, where there was one Torah given at Mount Sinai, and it applies to all time, even after Mashiach comes. Never changes. This is clearly in the Torah that Hashem said to Moshe, this is the law I'm giving you, do not add to it, do not take away from it. Okay, this law, how do we apply it? So we have to derive it. So we're looking in the Torah, and we see in the Torah ways, hints and ways to derive what the Torah is telling us. The question is, how can we assure that the laws that we derive are God-given? And we say they're God-given. How do we know? Here's an example of some outlandish interpretations of written law. The Third Amendment of the United States Constitution says, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Think about that for a moment, and I'm going to show you two interpretations that were actually suggested in law in the past. Do you see that written there? Anybody? How about this one? These were actual cases brought, I think, before I'm not sure, I think they were brought before the Supreme Court, that people wanted to push through laws based on the Third Amendment, which seemed to have nothing to do with the Third Amendment. How do we make sure that that doesn't happen? That a law is not just made up by people based on what they think that the Torah should say or should mean? How can we assure that the laws we derive are God-given? Question number one. There are other questions too, and we'll soon get to them. How come there's so many arguments? We'll get to them. But the answer is that there are hermeneutic principles given to Moshe at Sinai. In other words, Moshe got from God and taught to us the method by which we learn what it says in the Torah. When we have a question in the Torah that we don't know how to apply the halacha, the law doesn't adapt to the situation. The law applies to the situation. How do we know how to apply it? These are based on hermeneutic principles, they're called. That means 13 principles that were given to Moshe. So even though the actual derivation is done by the sages, but the method of the derivation was given to Moshe. This is a hard for you to read, I'm sure. These are the rules that you, Moshe, shall set before them. That's a verse in the Torah. Rabbi Yishmael says, this is in the Talmud, these are the 13 hermeneutic rules of Torah derivation which were given to Moses at Sinai. So even though the details were not given, the method was given to him. And as long as we follow the method, we're following Torah. Give you an example. Here's a game. This game is called Sudoku, whatever. So they have the written Torah is like, and the received oral Torah is this. The written Torah tells you these letters go right where they are. These numbers are right where they are, right? The received oral Torah tells you that they have to be, each one has to have, all nine numbers. Now, just a sec. Now, we'll get to the next. So, but there's still a lot of questions. What letters go where? We have to figure it out. What numbers go where? So for that, we need laws, rules of where these, to figure out, because I could put any number I want there. I could put another 7, I could put another 6. I need to know what the rules are. So I have rules, laws of what can go where. We can't just come to any conclusion, though, because there are rules. When we follow the rules, we'll figure out what has to go where. And it's the same, this is an analogy to the Torah. The written Torah gives us rules. When we follow those rules, we'll be able to fill in the blanks of those places where it's not clear to us what the actual law is. I'm going to stop for a moment and see if anyone has any comment on that.
Could you clarify in which part of the Torah hermeneutical principles are listed?
I'm going to, they're written in the Oral Torah. The actual principles are written in the Oral Torah, but you can see where they are. I'll give you some examples soon. You can see how they work in the written Torah, how they work in the Torah. But they're written in the Oral Torah. It's called a Braita of Rabbi Ishmael wrote them, and they are in the service. We say them right before the prayers every morning. Okay?
Rabbi, clearly Hashem knew all what he was doing, and clearly he did this with intention, knowing, of course, everything, and knowing, hard to believe, maybe not, that there would be computers one day, and we would be worried about what we do on Shabbat in a time of COVID.
Right.
So, he also desires us to reach, to understand, to not invent necessarily, but to derive. I mean, I guess is exactly what it is. And he knew that by giving us work to do, he also had to give us the key or a key to that work in terms of Torah and making it work the way he knew it was going to have to work 3,000 years later.
So right, exactly. So the key is the Oral Torah. And it's a key to the treasure, which is the written Torah. If you try and use your key somewhere else, it's not going to open the treasure. You can use the key anywhere you want. It's not going to open the treasure. Exactly, what you said is exactly right. Hashem gave us the Torah for all time, and he gave us the key. And that's what we're saying here, that he gave us these 13 principles by which we are able to study Torah and understand and look in the Torah and delve deeply into the Torah to understand whether or not we can turn our Zoom on before Shabbat and let it stream throughout the Shabbat. And the answer is no, except in a case of dire emergency, by the way. Let's go back to, and that's based on the 13 hermeneutic principles.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I wanted to mention, based on what you're saying in regards to like the laws of the Torah and the oral, the written and the oral, I look at it from this perspective as well. I don't know if anybody's here a lawyer, but I know that, like, let's say you're a landlord and you want to place an eviction on someone, there's specific ways to do it, because if you don't follow one little way, the law doesn't cover you at all. Okay?
That's a different concept, and I'll tell you why it's different.
Okay.
But ultimately, Congress can rewrite the laws, or the state can rewrite the laws, or a majority of states can come up, or however many states can come up and even change the Constitution of the United States. The Torah comes from Hashem, but the principle that you're saying is correct. Yes, There are laws.
That's what I meant in the sense of the principle.
The question is, though, what if a new law comes up, a new situation comes up that has not been addressed before? That's where the Supreme Court will carefully study the Constitution and the precedent and see how it works. So that's what I would say. It's not just a question of you following the law. It's a question of what we're talking about now is how is the law established? How do we know what the law is in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, the derived principles are as follows. What's called a kal vachomer. I'm going to give just two. There's many of them. I'm just going to give two. Kal vachomer means from the weak to the strong. You see the weak muscle and the strong muscle. From lenient to stringent, and from easy to hard. And I'm going to give examples to infer from the less obvious case to the more obvious case. In English, that's called a fortiori, and I always laugh when they give these words, a fortiori argument. I guess it's a legal thing, but to me, kal vachomer means more than a fortiori. I never knew what a fortiori meant until someone told me it's the kal vachomer. But anyway, it depends which approach you're taking, I guess. So here's an example of a kal vachomer. If you ask your boss for an extra hour of lunch and he doesn't allow it, do you think it's okay to take a day off? Certainly he's not going to let you take off a whole day. He doesn't even let you take off an hour. How much more so will he not allow you to take off a whole day? So that's a concept of a kal vachomer. And then there's something called a binyan av, means a father, which means the building of a father, which means a principle that applies to other places in the Torah that are similar. A parent law from which corollary is built. The law stated in one instance applies equally in different but similar instances. This is a very complicated, they're both very complicated. And we spend years in yeshiva studying this because is it similar or is it not similar? We have to even know what similar means. But here's the basics. So a binyan av, for example, we had an example of a kal vachomer. If your boss tells you that you can't eat lunch at your desk, so you figure from that, a binyan av, that you also shouldn't eat breakfast at your desk, depending on what the reason is. If the reason is because at the noon hour he doesn't want to see you eating, that's one thing. But if the reason is because he doesn't want or she doesn't want any crumbs on the desk, then obviously it would apply to any eating at the desk. That's a binyan av. It applies to all cases equally. Those are two examples of principles by which we learn the Torah. So if we see something here, we look elsewhere. Does it apply here? Does it not? Is it how much more so? Is it similar? Etc. Now, in general, there are laws that are human laws. And one of the problems with human laws is that when human beings come up with their own laws, that's not necessarily godly laws. So the idea of us being able to make our own laws, God didn't give us laws in order to give us laws. God didn't want to restrict our lives. That's not the purpose of the laws. As a matter of fact, when we read Torah and we learn Torah, especially with the giving of the Torah, we celebrate the giving of the Torah. What are you celebrating? You're celebrating Hashem gave you a bunch of laws. We're celebrating the fact that we have the ability to fulfill our mission on earth, to lift ourselves up, to connect with Hashem, to bring God's light to the world. We have a sense of purpose. We know that we have this purpose and we have this mission and we're able to fulfill it. And these rules are how we fulfill our purpose. And every one of these rules becomes part of this incredible, wonderful way of life that truly gives us meaning. If you make up your own laws, that's not the case. I'm doing it because I think it's right. Even if a whole society comes up with a law, it's a societal law. It's not necessarily a godly law. On the other hand, if we would read and hear and memorize the divine laws, wonderful. Those are godly laws, but they're not human. We haven't engaged in it. We haven't vested in it. We're just following rules. Following rules is fine, but that means the human is not vested and not involved and not a partner in the process. The ideal system that Hashem created was that people toil with their own minds to reveal the divine intent embedded in the Torah. So we have the best of both worlds. We have the divine law that God gave, but he gave it to us in a way specifically, didn't write it all down, didn't put it all there, besides the fact that it's impossible to write all the details. More than that, Hashem specifically wanted us to work with our minds, so the human mind is engaged in Torah. So we are partners with Hashem in bringing Torah to the world. Our minds are involved in godliness, in learning Hashem's will. And that way, every part of our lives, we are constantly connecting to the Torah, to the divine intent. So getting back to, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. You have the written Torah said, you're not allowed to cook a kid, a young goat, in its mother's milk. However, the Oral Torah expands on that, and it says, cooked or eaten, all meat, not just a young goat, in all milk, not just its mother's milk. How do we know that? So I'm not going to go into the whole process of all of it, how it shows all of it, but I will show one part of it, how the Kal V'chomer works. Kal V'chomer. The Torah doesn't say you can't eat milk and meat together. It just says 3 times in the Torah you cannot cook meat and milk together. Can you eat meat and milk together? Well, of course not. If you can't even cook it, Kal V'chomer that you can't eat it. Think of, if you were on my show last night, of the cheesecake. Imagine if I told my kids, don't touch the cheesecakes that are cooling in the kitchen. Well, I told them not to touch it. I didn't tell them not to eat it. Half of it will be gone, but there's a Kal V'chomer. If I told you not to touch it, how much more so should you not eat it? So that's an example of a Kal V'chomer where the Torah tells us do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Kal V'chomer, we're not allowed to eat it. There's a whole question, why doesn't the Torah just say explicitly don't eat it? And that's another whole discussion for another time. If I go into it, we won't have time to finish. So there's a reason for that too. So here we have the idea that it was received but derived. In other words, the principles were received, but they were given to us, but we derived them. We figured them out, how to apply them. And this expresses the inherent unity between the written and the received Torah, because everything in the received Torah that we received comes and is studying and learning and understanding the written Torah. It makes us active in the development of Torah because we have to learn it and understand it, and we have to derive what's written in the Torah. And it also helps us remember the Oral Torah, because the written Torah, this is the combination of both. The written Torah, it's like when you have, it's like the code that we have. The written Torah is the code. So if we look at the Oral Torah, and we see this in the Talmud a lot, and in the Oral Torah we see that, we're trying to understand this and that. We look back to the source and see, does it fit with the source or doesn't it? If it doesn't fit with the source, then we can't accept it. Okay, before we go on, I'm going to stop for a moment and see if anyone has anything to discuss here. Questions, comments?
Okay, is there a way to know which parshas or which part of Torah were derived and which were given?
Yes. Yes.
What is the way, if you can say?
We have to study Talmud. We have to study Torah. I mean, it's in the Talmud. It's all there. I mean, that's why people spend a lifetime studying all that. And it's very important to know what is written, what is received, what is derived, what is rabbinic, what is a custom. It's very important to know these things, and we spend a lot of time studying these things. Yes.
So the question, as we read the Torah, essentially, mostly we're reading a lot of stories. There are parts where it says that you can or cannot or should not do certain things, but a lot of it is storytelling. So where does the storytelling fit in? I mean, some of it doesn't necessarily point to a point.
Right. So the stories are there also to teach us how to live. Some of the stories actually contain laws. A lot of the stories don't. But in the stories are hidden the deepest secrets of Torah. And they are also teaching us about it. A lot of Kabbalah comes in the stories. But I'll give you an example, though. Rashi asked that question. The first Rashi in the Torah asked that question. Why doesn't the Torah start from the beginning, from Bereshit, of the creation? Why doesn't the Torah start from the first mitzvah the Jews were given in Egypt, which was Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month, and to use the lunar calendar? That's where the beginning of the commandments are given. Why does it start from Bereshit, all these stories? And Rashi says, because if nations will come along and claim that the land of Israel belongs to them, doesn't belong to the Jews, and you have stolen it. Ever heard such a claim? Anyway, if anybody will come along through the generations and say the land of Israel is occupied by the Jews, you have an answer right there. The Torah tells us God created the world. He gave temporarily gave the land to Canaan, took it away from them, gave it to us, and it's our land. It's right in the Torah. So even that, all of those stories are there to teach us that. Plus, there are many other things that we learn from them. Okay, let's go on a little bit, and a few more points here that are important. Here is the question. If we regard the Talmudic sages as expressing their own views, nothing is already about Talmudic debates. Okay, fine. If you would say that Talmudic sages were just discussing their own views, no problem. They're arguing, they're debating. This one thinks it should be this way. This one thinks it should be this way. But we're not saying that, are we? We're saying the Talmudic sages, those who teach us what God desires. How can you have Talmudic debate? How can you have two opposites? Does God say A or B? And if you look in the Torah, we see Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. We see this one and that one. We see so many different opinions. How can it all be from God? And here, I'm going to briefly explain this concept. Why don't the Talmudic debates undermine the validity of the entire halachic system? Which areas of Jewish law are subject to debate and difference of opinion? Why is there disagreement? Why would God want and or allow this? And how are the debates resolved? I'm not going to be able to go into all these questions, but just a little kind of a little taste of it. That which is written in the Torah and that which is received, there is no debate. The Torah does not say you need to take an etrog on Sukkot. The Torah says you shall take the fruit of a hadar tree. Doesn't say etrog. Hadar means beautiful tree. It could be an apple is beautiful. It could be a pomegranate is beautiful. How do we know it's an etrog? That was received from Moshe, that it means an etrog. And in the Talmud talks about how we know it was an etrog. But the Torah doesn't say it. But there's never been a dispute that it means anything but an etrog. Because that it was received. There is no possibility for dispute. Come on. Behave. There we go. So the received Torah, God-given explanations for each of the commandments, there can be no difference of opinion because it's clearly given to us by Moshe. It's called Halacha LaMoshe MiSinai. The laws that were given to Moshe at Sinai, that we do not have the ability to argue with. However, derived, there could be a difference of opinion. Laws that we derive from the written Torah and the received oral Torah, that we derive through the 13 principles, there sometimes is argument. Certainly in legislative, which we're not going into today, new laws, there's certainly sometimes difference of opinion, and certainly in customs. An example of that would be rice on Passover. Some people do, some people don't. Sephardim don't, Ashkenazim do, etc. So how is it possible, though, that in the laws we derive, that sometimes there are disagreements? I'm going to give you an example. It says, fear your lot. We're focusing on the last part. Let your brother live with you. We learn from let your brother live with you that if you're in the desert and you have one bottle of water and you need that bottle of water to get through the desert, otherwise you'll die. And you have another person with you. Should you share the water or should you not? does this verse, and let your brother live with you, teach us? There are actually two opinions. When Petura says with you, you don't have the right. Let your brother live with you. So if you're going to live, he's going to live. And if you're not going to live, he's not going to live. And vice versa. So therefore, share the water. And come what may, maybe a miracle will happen. But you can't just keep the water for yourself because your brother has to live with you. However, Rabbi Akiva says with you means secondary to you. Don't share the water. With you, you are there, and it's your water. Your brother shall live with you, but you don't have to give away the water. These are two opinions, and the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. The law is determined like Rabbi Akiva. How do we know that the law is like Rabbi Akiva? So we'll get to that in a minute. Debates are only about derivations without questioning the received law. The received law cannot have a debate. The derivation can have a debate, like that debate of how we derive from that verse whether we share the water or not. Going back to the fruit of a hadar tree. So there are various different explanations in the Talmud of how we know it is how we derive that it's an etrog. It's a fruit, it's a beautiful tree that is a tree whose bark tastes the same as its fruit. Another explanation, it can dwell. Hadar means it dwells. It dwells on a tree from year to year. That's only an etrog does that. A fruit that grows on much water. Hadar means hydra. None of these in themselves would prove that the word hadar in the Torah means a etrog. But the reception, what we've received is that it means an etrog. That we know. The derivation of how it comes to mean an etrog, that there's a debate about. There's a debate about the derivation, but not the law, because the law has been handed down. That law has been handed down. Going back to the debate of how can you debate then? Are there debates about facts? There are no debates about the received oral Torah. But we haven't answered the question, because still, how do we figure out derived oral Torah? Is there are debates? Didn't we say it's part of God's Torah also? So how can that work? You with me? So here, and this is, I think, Joan, this is kind of what you were saying. Multiple and divergent opinions don't start with the human mind, they start with God himself. God created us differently. God created our minds differently to think differently. God gave us different midot, different attributes, different emotions. Some people are moved towards kindness and tolerance. Some people move towards judgment and more strictness. And people look through things through their own lens. God made us that way because God wanted to create a world which is diverse, and that the Torah should permeate every part of the world, including the human mind, including all of the differences that we bring together to create a whole world. So they come from God. And Hashem made the entire world multifaceted. So an example, so there are many, many facets in the world. And because the Torah is supposed to embrace every part of the world, as I've talked to someone recently about this, that the idea is that the Torah, the godliness should permeate the entire world, every facet of the world. And therefore we must study every part of the world. And things in the world have different interpretations and different views. An example of that is apple pits. Apple pits contain cyanide. Cyanide is poisonous for you. But a little bit of poison in the cyanide in an apple pit is not going to kill you. So in an apple, it's okay. But in drinking a cyanide will kill you. What does that mean? That means that when we are studying it, so someone may focus on the fact that the seed, apple seed, has cyanide. Whoa, that's forbidden. Stay away from it. Someone else is looking at it and saying, no, it's not a problem because it's part of the whole apple. It's not a good idea to eat apple pits, but it's not going to kill you. But nevertheless, there is some poison there. So the one who says it's forbidden is looking at that facet of it and saying it's forbidden. The one who says it's permitted is looking at a different facet of it and saying it's permitted. And all of that is necessary to be able to really discuss and cover what it is that the Torah wants from us on every detail. But when it comes to practice, there has to be one way to practice. Talmudic debate is like musical harmony. You have a huge symphony and everybody's playing together. Every once in a while, There's the violin solo, or the piano solo, or this solo. There is the wood instruments, the string instruments. Every one of them has a place in the symphony, but every once in a while, one of them has to do the solo. And the same way it is. All of the laws of the Torah and the debates of the Torah and the discussions of the Torah are all part of the multifaceted beauty of Torah in our minds. But then comes a way to establish the law. And this also was given to us by God. God told us we go by the majority. The majority does not mean the majority of people living in the world. The majority does not even mean the majority of rabbis who call themselves or are given the title rabbi. The majority means the majority of faithful to the Torah in this form, great scholars who understand every facet of Torah, and they look at it in different ways, and then the majority rules. Whatever is written in the Talmud is considered valid for all people at all times, because that was a majority. Then after the Talmud was closed, there were things that were not resolved in the Talmud, differences of opinion, or new situations that come up. So the rabbis debate the meaning of a Talmudic ruling when there's a new question that comes up on it, or there's a question that came up after the Talmud was completed that was never discussed before, or the Talmud let a debate stand without resolving it. Then we have to look at it. And how do we determine it? We determine it by the majority. But the majority in Judaism is not fighting. It's not like, unfortunately, what's happening in America today, where there's so much fighting against each other, the majority, the minority, whatever. They learn to coexist and love each other. Hillel and Shammai were two great sages who had very different opinions, but they were the closest friends. And in the Sanhedrin, in the Supreme Court, in the time of the temple, or today, when there's a debate about a halacha, new halacha that comes up, so there is a majority, eventually there's a consensus that's reached. And everybody understands that that's how we approach it. Yes, I understand it my way, but you know what? I have to go by the majority. And ultimately in Torah, we strive, and in the times of the Sanhedrin, they would reach that point, where the minority would join the majority, and then true peace in those days, in the times of the Sanhedrin, true peace would dawn upon the Jewish people. Because what would happen is the minority would accept the rule of the majority, and then the Sanhedrin would issue a joint ruling by everybody that this is the way it is. There was no minority opinion ever published in the Jewish Supreme Court. Because once the majority ruled, that became the court's opinion, and it was forbidden for anyone to say, well, I ruled otherwise, but what could I do? The majority said so. We're not supposed to do that, because the majority becomes the majority. The halacha, this is God's will, this is how God set it up. And that is a brief synopsis of how the Oral Torah, where it comes from, how it is connected to written Torah, and how it's formed, and how we come to conclusions. Zhenya asked the parshas that not Zhenya, Alex. The parshas that we read recently, what we're reading is written. When we interpret a word, usually it's received, but there's a lot of derived, and I would have to take step by step to go through it. The next few times we study, you can ask me, was this derived? Was this received? Be happy to discuss it. The other parts of it that we didn't discuss were, again, rabbinic laws, and how does that work? The Torah, one of the 613 commandments is for us to follow the rabbinic laws, and customs, where they came from, that's another whole discussion, hopefully for another time. And now I'm going to stop and ask for your comments and input and questions and discussion.
So is there a place where we can, these materials that you've put up, is there a place where we can see them and download them or something?
There's a book, a JLI book, write down the word Judaism Decoded. And if you could, after the holiday, check with me, and I'll see if we have one. If we don't, we can probably order one for you if you really want.